It's high time the G7 Club was expanded to take account of the changing global economic realities. 20 years ago, capitalism was largely confined to Western Europe, North America, and a handful of developing countries, mostly in East Asia. We are now on the threshold of a new and complex era of global capitalism, one which offers great opportunities for dynamism, but also deep risks of global unrest. 20 years ago, the original G7 countries accounted for as much as 90% of the whole output of all capitalist economies, measured by the GDP of each country. Now, with the spread of capitalism and the growth of emerging markets, their share has dropped down to around 50%. So, although the G7 countries still represent the richest part of the capitalist world, and they are still the largest international traders, they can no longer presume to speak for the world market economies. They also will have to think hard about new ways of managing the capitalist system, and their thinking this time must involve developing countries. The developing countries were not part of the initial summitry process, but today they constitute 4/5 of the world's population, and their GDP constitutes around half of the world's GDP, and on the purchasing power, which means the amount of bang you might buy with $1 in one country compared to the other. China is now the second largest economy in the world, and India ranks fifth, and Brazil, Russia, and Mexico, depending on whose numbers one uses, are all larger than Canada in terms of purchasing power. And including some of the larger developing countries in the annual summitry would not only be the question of fairness or increased legitimacy for the international system, but also a matter of self-interest for the US, for Canada, for Europe, and for Japan, since economic stability in the emerging market affects their economies, the advanced economies as well. Moreover, some of the crucial global issues such as global warming or protection of endangered species will require greatly enhanced global cooperation. And the G7 countries have long stood for both market economies and representative democracy, and this dual purpose suggests that democratic Brazil and India should soon be admitted into annual summitry, while Russia should become a full-fledged summit participant if it demonstrates the durability and stability of its nascent democratic system. The whole world will breathe easier when China too can be admitted as a democratic partner in the world system. An expanded G7 must give a much harder thought to the areas where economic reform will not be enough to lift the scourge of poverty. In some parts of the world, like Central Europe or Argentina, economic reforms will be enough, and they will make the difference between poverty and growth. And that's because the access to international trade is good and can ensure that economic reforms will translate into good economic performance. But in other areas, the situation is different, and economic reforms will not be enough to overcome the heart-wrenching and politically destabilizing poverty. The world system is at its historic watershed, and on the positive side, capitalism is the greatest economic system ever invented. The spread of capitalism to the whole world may ensure global growth, and some countries that are flexible enough will benefit from such from such a system. But on a negative side, the limits of capitalism are exemplified by today's G7 summitry. G7 are a small and declining part of the world's population, and unless the big developing countries are brought into the international system in an equitable manner, the global stability will be put at risk, and global environmental questions may be left unattended. Moreover, in the next 30 years, the world's population is expected to rise by an astounding 2.5 billion people, and the growth will take place in the poorest countries, and these are the areas that are under ecological stress. So we would better start now to mobilize our skills, energy, and creativity to make sure that globalization works for everyone equally, or else we may find ourselves caught in politically and economically destabilizing instability made of our own neglect.